On December 7, 1941, before dawn had fully spread across Pearl Harbor, hundreds of Japanese planes descended upon the ships of the United States Pacific Fleet, turning the calm waters into a sea of fire and smoke. The proud battleships, symbols of American power in the Pacific, now drifted ablaze, black smoke rising skyward like a warning that could not be ignored. In Tokyo, in the Navy Ministry's conference rooms, Japanese officers applauded and congratulated each other on an attack they believed had struck a crippling blow to the United States. Japanese leaders celebrated, sending out messages of victory, as cheers, laughter, and pride rang out, reinforced by the shock of surprise. Yet amid the atmosphere of jubilation, one man sat in silence, his face betraying no emotion, though inside his mind churned with dark premonitions, a worry no one else could fully grasp. That man was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the brilliant commander behind the Pearl Harbor Plan, the only figure among Japan's military leadership who truly understood the latent strength of the United States and the consequences that this attack had just unleashed. Yamamoto had lived in America. He had walked through the massive automobile factories of Detroit, seen the oil fields stretching to the horizon in Texas, witnessed the abundant and energetic lives of American citizens, the modern cities, sprawling transportation networks, and mechanized farms producing far more than anything he had ever seen in Japan. He knew that Japan, with its limited resources, small industrial base, and constrained population, had awakened an opponent it could never hope to defeat in a long-term war. In Yamamoto's heart, the warnings he had given Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe 6 months before the attack echoed like prophecy. I can guarantee difficulty for the enemy for the first 6 months, but I have no confidence if the war lasts 2 or 3 years. These words now carried the weight of foresight, for they had just ignited a chain of events that would determine the fate of both nations. Tactically, the Pearl Harbor attack was a resounding success. 8 battleships were sunk or damaged, nearly 200 American planes destroyed, and the U.S. forces taken completely by surprise. Yet, the U.S. fleet's main aircraft carriers were not at the base and thus escaped Japanese hands. More seriously, the attack united a previously divided America, transforming a population of indifference and skepticism into a nation ready to fight. Yamamoto understood that mathematically, Japan's defeat had already been written in numbers, comparisons of production capacity and resources, but his colleagues, swept up in the thrill of victory, had not realized it. They failed to see that within the military and economic data, figures on U.S. industrial output, shipping capacity, and arms production already foretold an outcome Japan could not reverse. In the 1930s, Japan pursued an aggressive expansionist policy to secure resources and living space for its growing population. The invasion of Manchuria in 1931, the all-out war with China beginning in 1937, and the occupation of French Indochina in 1940 reflected a determination to build a self-sufficient empire. Yet from the very beginning, Japanese strategists recognized the enormous disparity between Japan's industrial capacity and that of the United States. In 1937, Japanese industry accounted for only about 5.2% of global industrial output, on par with France, and only half that of Britain or the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, the U.S. accounted for nearly 42% of the world's industrial output. Even during the Great Depression, America's war potential was 7 to 10 times greater than Japan's. These figures were analyzed, discussed, and remembered by Japanese officers. Despite this awareness, Japanese leaders chose to gamble. They placed faith in a strategic assumption. Japan would use the victory at Pearl Harbor to launch swift campaigns to seize resource-rich territories in Southeast Asia and create an occupation zone so vast that the United States would lack the patience or willingness to fight a long war, forcing acceptance of Japanese territorial gains. This assumption, seemingly bold, was essentially a psychological test of the opponent, but it completely ignored the fundamental differences in economy, production capacity, and national spirit between America and Japan. Yamamoto understood this better than most. He knew the Americans were not a weak or easily intimidated enemy. They were a nation with enormous economic, industrial, and human resources, capable of transforming production potential into unprecedented fighting power. Before the war began, Yamamoto repeatedly warned the Japanese government that any naval race or prolonged conflict with the U.S. was beyond Japan's capacity. He had seen Detroit's continuous automobile production lines, producing as many cars in a short period as Japan produced in total. He had witnessed Texas oil fields yielding more than Japan's entire reserves, and observed the abundant living standards and virtually limitless material reserves of the United States. What he saw filled him with deep concern, but he could not prevent the militarist factions from pushing Japan into war. To protect himself from political intrigue and potential assassination, Yamamoto was assigned to command the combined fleet, where he bore immense military responsibility while concealing his deep strategic doubts. When the attack occurred, Yamamoto realized that hope is not a strategy. The Pearl Harbor victory, though tactically impressive, was merely the beginning of a war Japan could not sustain. Numbers, from ships, planes, manpower to supply production, were stacked against them. Yet most Japanese officers, intoxicated by victory and their own fighting spirit, refused to acknowledge the truth. Yamamoto, despite masterminding the audacious plan, quietly understood that they had awakened a giant who had never stirred so fiercely. This giant, once awake, would retaliate not only militarily, but also by leveraging its full industrial capacity to crush any hope of Japanese victory. Even as Japanese fleets attacked bases in the Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies in the following days, creating an empire stretching from China to the Central Pacific. From the Aleutians to near Australia, Yamamoto remained cautious. While early victories emboldened other officers to believe that American industrial capacity had been exaggerated, Yamamoto noted warning signs in small but significant American actions, such as the bold Doolittle raid and the repair of USS Yorktown within 72 hours after the Battle of the Coral Sea, all demonstrating that America's latent power far exceeded Japan's. Imagination, December 7, 1941, the day Japan believed it had gained the advantage, was in fact the day a chain of events began that they could never control. On that day, they did not merely attack a naval base. They awakened a colossal industrial war machine, an opponent whose production capacity and national resolve far surpassed anything Japan could imagine. In that moment, Yamamoto understood that no matter how flawless the Pearl Harbor tactics, Japan's long-term fate had been determined by the enemy's industrial might and scale. He knew the real battle had yet to begin, and a United States now awakened would not rest until vengeance was complete. Immediately after the shock of Pearl Harbor, America seemed to awaken from a long slumber, as if shaken by an earthquake. But instead of succumbing, the entire nation entered an unprecedented period of recovery and resurgence. Less than a month after the attack, President Franklin D. Roosevelt appeared before Congress, not only detailing the damage but also setting war production goals that even his most skilled advisors considered impossible. 60,000 aircraft in 1942, rising to 125,000 in 1943, and 20,000 tanks, 55,000 anti-aircraft guns, all numbers that seemed beyond imagination. Yet America, with its unparalleled industrial power, not only met these targets but far exceeded them. Factories ran day and night, production lines never stopped, and workers, men, women, from every walk of life, joined the war effort en masse, transforming the entire economy into a colossal war machine. Women entered factories, young men worked overtime, engineers and managers innovated processes, farmers mechanized fields to increase output, all creating an economy operating at a pace and scale Japan, or any other nation, could hardly imagine. While Japan remained overconfident, believing that early victories would intimidate America, the Americans proved otherwise. Early signs appeared in small but significant operations. The Doolittle raid on April 18, 1942, though limited in tactical damage, delivered a psychological shock impossible to ignore. 16 B-25 bombers took off from USS Hornet, flying nearly 650 miles across the Pacific to strike Tokyo, Yokohama, and other Japanese cities. Material losses were minimal, but the psychological impact was immense. For the first time since the campaign began, Japan's sacred territory had been violated, and some Japanese leaders began to sense that the quick victory strategy did not guarantee absolute success. From their lightning victories, Japan began to perceive subtle but critical warning signs of American resilience. Subsequent battles, such as the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, further demonstrated America's latent strength. Tactically, there was no clear victor, but Japan's strategic plan to capture Port Moresby had to be abandoned. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, Japanese advances were halted, and America showed it could confront the Japanese fleet even when its numbers and positions were not yet ideal. The culmination of this realization came at the Battle of Midway, June 4–7, 1942, where Japan, aiming to annihilate the remaining U.S. fleet, suffered a strategic catastrophe. Yamamoto had devised the Midway plan to lure American carriers into a decisive trap, relying on intelligence that USS Yorktown had been damaged at Coral Sea, and that only 2 U.S. carriers remained in the area. In reality, American naval workers at Pearl Harbor performed miracles. Yorktown was repaired in just 72 hours, and 3 U.S. carriers were ready to face 4 Japanese carriers. Furthermore, American codebreakers partially deciphered Japan's JN-25 codes, turning Midway into a perfect trap. As Japanese planes left their carriers to strike Midway Island, Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers from USS Enterprise and Yorktown simultaneously attacked Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, inflicting devastating losses in minutes. All 4 of Japan's main carriers were destroyed. Over 3,000 sailors and hundreds of skilled pilots perished, and America, suffering far fewer losses, began to seize the initiative. Midway was not only a tactical defeat, but also revealed the fundamental disparity in production capacity and strategy between the 2 nations. Japan, with limited resources, could not quickly replace lost carriers and pilots, while America converted its vast industrial potential into continuous combat power. The U.S. industrial system, with modern assembly lines, skilled labor, and optimized management, allowed the construction of dozens of carriers, hundreds of aircraft, and thousands of tanks and transport vehicles, while Japan struggled with limited numbers. From mid-1942 onward, America deployed its production and organizational capabilities on a massive scale. Factories like Ford's Willow Run produced a B-24 Liberator bomber in just 63 minutes, a pace unprecedented in history. U.S. aircraft production from 1939 to 1945 reached nearly 297,000 planes, compared to Japan's 76,000. Similarly, America produced 86,000 tanks versus Japan's 2,000, 2 million trucks versus Japan's 165,000. Steel, oil, aluminum, and electronics factories operated at full capacity, far exceeding initial estimates. These numbers were not mere statistics. They became battlefield realities, determining the outcome of engagements from Guadalcanal and Midway to the Mariana Islands and the Philippines. Guadalcanal, from August 1942 to February 1943, exemplified America's ability to sustain combat over thousands of nautical miles. Japan, prepared for swift, decisive battles, gradually realized severe limitations in logistics, transport, and reinforcement capabilities. Japanese merchant fleets were repeatedly sunk by U.S. submarines, and stockpiles of essential resources dwindled. In contrast, America, thanks to industrial capacity, maintained continuous supply lines and reinforcements. While Japan relied on fighting spirit and the Bushido ethos, America demonstrated that morale alone could not overcome overwhelming material superiority. U.S. pilots were well trained, and aircraft continuously evolved from F-4F Wildcats to F-6F Hellcats and F-4U Corsairs, surpassing Japanese planes in both quantity and quality. Japanese pilots rushed through shortened training programs, lost combat experience, and suffered increasingly heavy losses. By 1944, America began converting industrial power into a full-scale offensive. The Mariana Islands were captured, placing B-29 Superfortress bombers within striking distance of Japan. The Philippine Campaign and the Battle of the Philippine Sea demonstrated America's total dominance. Japan lost almost its entire remaining fleet, over 10,000 troops, and nearly all ability to counterattack at sea. Differences in logistics, supplies, and materiel made American campaigns easier while Japan gradually became exhausted. All these achievements, from Midway to the Marianas, from aircraft production to strategic bombing, proved that America had risen from the ashes not just with spirit but with full industrial, scientific, and organizational capacity. Japan, initially underestimating its opponent, gradually realized that it had awakened a giant, and every battle, every ship, every plane confirmed that this enemy was not only awake but operating at full strength. Had Yamamoto lived to witness it, He would have seen his earliest premonitions realized. The victory at Pearl Harbor merely unified America, mobilizing the nation's full potential and transforming enormous production numbers into unstoppable combat power. The day Japan believed marked the beginning of its triumph had in fact inaugurated the full operation of the American war machine. From the ashes of Pearl Harbor, America rose strong, determined, and ready to crush all enemy plans. In early June 1942, the Japanese Navy believed that victory over the United States was only a matter of time. Yamamoto, with all his experience and understanding of American industrial and national strength, still harbored deep unease, but the Midway plan had been set in motion with the hope of delivering a decisive blow, ending America's ability to counterattack in the Pacific. His plan was ambitious: lure the U.S. carriers into a decisive naval battle, destroy the enemy fleet, and consolidate the triumph of Pearl Harbor. Japan believed it held the initiative. America, in their assessment, was still weak and unprepared, but a harsh reality awaited. American intelligence had partially broken Japan's JN-25 code, giving Washington insight into the target and timing of the Midway operation. When Midway sent a false message claiming a shortage of fresh water, Japan inadvertently confirmed the intelligence, turning the island into an irresistible trap. As Japanese carriers launched their aircraft, the Americans were ready, with a force far more balanced than Japan had anticipated. On June 4th, at dawn over the Pacific, the carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu began launching planes to attack Midway. Japanese pilots, gathered on the decks with fuel and ordnance loaded, had no idea they were flying into a tactical trap. Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers from USS Enterprise in Yorktown, despite flying hundreds of miles, were in position. Simultaneously, within minutes, bombs struck Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, igniting fires, detonating fuel stores, and destroying dozens of aircraft on the decks. Hiryu, the final Japanese carrier, also suffered heavy damage, surviving only temporarily. The defeat at Midway was more than a material loss. Over 3,000 Japanese sailors, pilots, and aviation technicians perished, along with nearly 100 elite fighter pilots who could not be replaced. The carrier groups, the heart of the Japanese fleet, were nearly neutralized. In contrast, America lost 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, 150 aircraft, and 307 personnel, a relatively light toll. The result not only shifted the balance of power but marked a strategic turning point, initiating America's unstoppable rise in the Pacific. The core difference lay in production capacity and the ability to sustain a prolonged war. America, with its vast industrial base, could quickly replace lost carriers and planes while training new pilots. Japan, with limited resources, could not compensate for lost carriers and aviators. Each ship and pilot lost was a step backward that could not easily be recovered. Midway exposed a fundamental flaw in Japanese strategy. They underestimated American industrial capacity and national resolve, believing early victories would force submission. But reality proved all assumptions wrong. This defeat presented a painful paradox for Japan. Earlier victories had bred overconfidence, but facing Midway, that confidence became a double-edged sword. Japanese commanders, still trusting in the quick strike strategy, began to realize that their assumptions about American endurance and willingness to surrender were completely mistaken. Yamamoto understood that he had awakened a giant. America, with unprecedented industrial capability, had now turned potential into continuous combat power, capable of rapidly replacing losses. Immediately after Midway, the U.S. began transforming tactical advantage into strategic strength. Essex-class carriers, massive vessels carrying over 90 aircraft each, were constructed at astonishing speed, 1 every 6 weeks. Japan in the same period could build only 6 carriers. Quantity aside, America's quality and strategic deployment capacity surpassed Japan. Aircraft became increasingly advanced, pilots were rigorously trained, and logistics were abundant. Each subsequent Pacific battle, from Guadalcanal to the Mariana Islands, demonstrated that America could not only win at sea, but sustain relentless power Japan could not match. Midway also changed American commanders' mindset. They seized the initiative, launching operations with full confidence, no longer fearing Japanese counterattacks. Subsequent campaigns, though not always smooth, shared a common factor. The U.S. could deploy large forces, supply them continuously, and replace losses immediately, while Japan gradually depleted its resources, pilots, ships, and aircraft. The deep impact of Midway was not only material but psychological and strategic. Senior Japanese officers, once confident they controlled the situation, began to recognize their errors. From that point, no minor victory could alter the overall trend. Americans, leveraging superior production, would continue to dominate every theater. This crisis forced Japan to expand defensive lines in occupied territories, prolonging exhaustion rather than reversing the course of war. Midway also highlighted the importance of intelligence in modern warfare. The breaking of JN-25, the coordination between U.S. naval and air units, and effective aircraft deployment turned information into strategic power. Japan, despite knowing U.S. production and capabilities, failed to grasp America's ability to convert potential into reality. Midway was the clearest example of strategic misjudgment. They knew the numbers, but did not believe America could turn them into overwhelming combat power. Even after Midway, Yamamoto continued to pursue offensive plans, but the momentum had shifted. Japan no longer had the opportunity for decisive strikes. Every operation became defensive or aimed at delaying the inevitable. Meanwhile, America leveraged each small victory to consolidate the initiative, enhance logistics, and continue deploying its immense industrial power. Midway marked the moment the Pacific War truly shifted in America's favor, from potential to reality, from defensive posture to absolute initiative. Thus, Midway was not just a naval battle but a comprehensive turning point. Japan realized long-term victory over the U.S. was impossible. America demonstrated its ability to transform industrial capacity into sustainable war strategy, and differences in industry, logistics, and strategy became decisive. This lesson went beyond naval tactics or strategy. It was about a nation's total capability, production, organization, training, logistics, and intelligence. Rising from the ashes of Pearl Harbor, America at Midway showed not only a return, but the onset of overwhelming dominance, forcing Japan into a defensive, gradually weakening position. With the defeat at Midway, Japan entered a chain reaction, losing initiative, losing elite pilots and carriers, forced to extend defensive lines to compensate, while America continued to leverage superior power. Midway marked the decisive turning point, not only at sea but in overall strategy. From this point, the U.S. seized the initiative, and Japan, though still relying on fighting spirit and tactical skill, faced an irreversible reality. They were steadily losing, comprehensively. After Midway, Japan still clung to the hope that long-term victory was possible if they held their occupied positions and maximized resource exploitation. But the reality of the Pacific battlefield gradually revealed the staggering gap between American strength and Japan's ability to sustain a prolonged war. From the start of the Guadalcanal campaign in August 1942 to the Mariana Islands campaign in 1944, the U.S. steadily transformed its immense industrial potential into tangible combat power. While Japan faced shortages of both material and manpower, at Guadalcanal, the U.S. demonstrated for the first time its ability to sustain combined naval and ground operations over an extended period. Initially, Japan believed that quick, decisive battles would secure victory, but the Americans conducted a patient, methodical campaign with continuous resupply. They could replace troops, aircraft, equipment, and ammunition continuously, while Japan struggled with long supply lines vulnerable to American submarines and air attacks. Japanese forces, though courageous and well-trained, could not recover losses quickly. Limited resources led to gradual attrition. The battle became a war of attrition, where America's endurance clearly surpassed Japan's. Meanwhile, the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, and surrounding areas vividly illustrated the differences in logistics. The U.S. employed a wide range of measures, from transport by ship and plane, securing supply routes to rapid repair and maintenance of damaged vessels. American industry produced aircraft, ammunition, and warships in quantities Japan could only dream of. New superior planes were continuously deployed, while Japan relied on outdated equipment, rapidly depleted pilots, and diminishing support forces. By 1943, Japan realized that maintaining extended defensive lines was an enormous burden. They could not produce enough warships, aircraft, or transport vessels to replace losses. Carriers, the center of naval power, had been heavily depleted at Midway and subsequent battles, with only a few replacements constructed. Fighter aircraft, though initially effective, were becoming obsolete compared to new American designs like the F-6F Hellcat and F-4U Corsair, and numbers were insufficient to maintain air superiority. Meanwhile, the U.S. produced aircraft en masse, continuously improved designs and trained pilots systematically, creating overwhelming manpower and material advantages. A vivid example was the Mariana Islands campaign in the summer of 1944, where Japan faced near-total destruction of its mobile naval forces for the first time. The assaults on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam showed that America not only outnumbered Japanese forces, but also excelled in logistics and coordination between Navy, Air Force, and ground troops. Japanese units, though tenacious, were constantly short on ammunition, food, and medical supplies, while Americans were well supplied, maneuverable, and capable of overwhelming attacks. Saipan fell on July 9th, Tinian on August 1st, and Guam on August 10th, opening the way for B-29 superfortresses to directly threaten the Japanese home islands. The Mariana Campaign also marked the near collapse of Japanese air power. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, or the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, on June 19, 1944, starkly demonstrated the material and skill gap. Hundreds of Japanese aircraft were shot down in just 2 days, along with 3 carriers, including the new Taiho. American losses were minimal in comparison. Japan's elite pilots, the foundation of its naval strategy, were virtually annihilated and could not be replaced due to shortened training programs and limited resources. On land, Japan faced battles it was ill-prepared for. The U.S. demonstrated the ability to occupy, maintain supply, and deploy large forces on distant islands. Japanese forces, accustomed to swift operations and elite tactics, were forced into prolonged attritional fights, exposing every limitation in manpower, logistics, and industry. Maintaining defensive forces across numerous islands became impossible as supply ships were continuously targeted by American submarines and aircraft. The U.S. also continuously optimized combat efficiency. Newly produced planes replaced those lost in battle, pilots were trained and rotated, and ships and supply vessels were repaired almost immediately. Compared to Japan, the difference was absolute. Japan could fight bravely but could not replace losses, while America turned every casualty into an opportunity to strengthen its forces. Beyond material power, the war exposed differences in strategy and mindset. Japan still believed that fighting spirit, Bushido, and loyalty could compensate for shortages in numbers and technology. The concept of Yamato Damashi, or Japanese spirit, continued to guide decisions, leading to mass sacrifices of personnel and assets, trusting that spirit and tactics could offset deficiencies. In contrast, America understood that modern warfare relied on industrial capability, logistics, and sustained combat power, not merely individual fighting spirit. By 1944, Japanese defensive lines began to crumble. Losing the Mariana Islands, Japan not only lost strategic positions but also exposed the home islands to air attacks. B-29 superfortresses from the Marianas began bombing Japan directly, destroying industrial centers, major cities, and infrastructure, causing massive civilian casualties. This starkly demonstrated that Japan no longer had the ability to resist American power, at sea, in the air, or on land. Meanwhile, American forces under MacArthur and Nimitz leveraged advantages in warships, carriers, aircraft, and logistics to steadily advance toward Japan. Each campaign underscored America's material dominance. Troops were fully supplied, weapons and ammunition plentiful, aircraft continuously replenished and upgraded, while Japan was depleted in every resource. The Mariana Campaign became a symbol of the absolute contrast between the two war economies. American industrial capacity transformed potential into real combat power, while Japan was left relying on outdated spirit and tactics. These events forced senior Japanese officers to confront a painful truth. Victory over America through quick conquest and minimal losses was impossible. They had misjudged American capability and determination, believing early victories would discourage the U.S., when in fact each Japanese setback strengthened America, allowing adjustments in strategy and full exploitation of industrial and human resources. Yamamoto and a few other officers foresaw this, but most only realized it after repeated campaign failures, depleted resources, and staggering losses among Japanese military and civilians. By 1944, The overall picture was clear. Japan had lost the ability to sustain long-term war, while America, through production, logistics, and coordinated strategy, had turned potential into reality. The Mariana Islands, the Battle of the Philippine Sea, and subsequent campaigns proved that the U.S. not only excelled in quantity, but also in quality and sustained combat capability. Japan no longer had any opportunity to reverse the situation, and reliance on spirit and individual sacrifice became meaningless against superior American material and logistics. In this context, Japanese commanders realized an essential truth. They had misjudged their opponent from the start. The intelligence they had on U.S. production, warships, aircraft, and manpower could not convey the full combat power of America. They failed to envision how the U.S. would deploy its enormous resources, sustain continuous war, and integrate technology, manpower, and tactics into overwhelming combined strength. Each battle, from Guadalcanal to the Marianas, was living proof that America was not just potential. It was a realized, overwhelming force, and Japan faced comprehensive defeat. The lessons from this period shaped Japanese awareness for the remainder of the war. They understood that there was no opportunity to regain the initiative, that every minor victory would only delay defeat, and that American power exceeded prediction. This harsh reality became the basis for Japan to prepare for final defensive battles, sacrificial conflicts that could not change the overall course. Part 4 concludes with Japan facing an undeniable truth. The true power of America had been proven on the battlefield. From Guadalcanal to the Marianas, America transformed vast industrial capacity into continuous combat strength, while Japan, though brave and sacrificial, could no longer compete. This was the moment when Japan, once confident in quick victory and martial spirit, had to confront the opponent's comprehensive superiority and prepare for the final defensive battles under a losing hand. After witnessing American strength firsthand in the Guadalcanal, Mariana, and Philippine Sea campaigns, Japan gradually realized that all their initial calculations had been mistaken. The belief that fighting spirit, Bushido, and quick victories could compensate for material shortages had collapsed. However, this realization came too late, when all opportunities to alter the course of the war had passed, and Japan entered a period of comprehensive crisis. 44 marked a fateful turning point. The Mariana Islands fell, and B-29 Superfortress bombers from the Marianas began direct attacks on the Japanese home islands, destroying industrial centers, homes, and infrastructure. As the U.S. continued to advance with superior warships, aircraft, reinforcements, and abundant supplies, Japan could no longer sustain the war at the necessary level. Many officers who had hoped to turn the tide through tactics or spirit now faced the reality that all efforts only delayed inevitable defeat. In a short period, all Japanese defensive lines were breached. Islands from the Marianas to Palau fell to the U.S., opening a direct route to Japan. The Imperial Japanese Navy, once a formidable force and the pride of the empire, was severely weakened. Consecutive naval battles, from the Philippine Sea to Leyte Gulf, cost Japan numerous aircraft carriers, capital ships, and elite pilots. The Japanese army on land also became exhausted, facing shortages of ammunition, food, and disrupted supply lines caused by U.S. naval and submarine operations. By 1945, American industrial power had achieved total dominance. Thousands of aircraft, warships, tanks, artillery, and supply vehicles were produced and deployed monthly. Meanwhile, Japan could not maintain production. Many industrial facilities were destroyed by U.S. air attacks, and resources from Southeast Asia became increasingly scarce due to targeted supply disruptions. New aircraft and warships were rare, pilots inadequately trained, and militia forces, however brave, could not compensate for the comprehensive material shortages. Amid this, the Japanese government fell into political crisis. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, who had led Japan into war, was forced to resign following the Mariana defeat. His successor, General Kuniaki Koiso, inherited an almost hopeless situation: exhausted military forces, a weakened navy, a starving population, and no remaining diplomatic options. Negotiations with the Soviet Union, aimed at creating a channel for peace, collapsed when Stalin broke the Neutrality Pact and declared war on Japan in August 1945, eliminating the last diplomatic avenue. Soviet entry into the war delivered a strategic shock. Japanese forces in Manchuria, once considered the strongest fortress, were quickly defeated. All defensive lines Japan had deemed secure collapsed within days. The nation found itself surrounded on all fronts, air, sea, and land, with no chance to reverse the situation. The reality of American power and the horrors of modern war became unmistakably clear. Japan had been fighting an unwinnable war from the start. The disaster became even more apparent in the final land and naval battles. Japanese forces continued to resist with Bushido spirit, willing to sacrifice to the last man, but this could not compensate for material and numerical deficiencies. The battles of Okinawa and Iwo Jima became symbols of desperation, fighting to the end but unable to achieve victory. Meanwhile, the Americans conducted offensives with overwhelming superiority in troops, logistics, and technology, demonstrating the immense disparity in overall capability. The B-29 bombing campaign, particularly the firebombing of Tokyo, Operation Meeting House, on the night of March 9–10, 1945, demonstrated the comprehensive destruction Japan faced. Hundreds of thousands of civilians died, industrial centers were destroyed, and most major cities were reduced to ashes. This was the largest industrial and civilian destruction campaign in human history before the atomic bombings. It made Japan understand that continuing the war was impossible, even though the fighting spirit had not yet broken. When the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, the awakening became absolute. Military leaders still hoped to continue fighting, aiming to inflict casualties on the Americans to secure honorable peace terms. But this time, even tactical or samurai-based arguments could not mask the reality. Japan had lost all advantages. Only the direct intervention of Emperor Hirohito could break the deadlock. On August 15, 1945, the emperor's voice was broadcast on the radio for the first time. Though he did not explicitly say surrender, it signaled acceptance of the reality that the war had ended. The war concluded with Japan utterly devastated, millions of military personnel and civilians dead, cities, industrial centers, and infrastructure destroyed, and the armed forces almost entirely eliminated. In post-war interrogations and trials, many Japanese leaders, including Tojo, admitted they had misjudged America's true strength. They knew the numbers and production capacity, but could not imagine how the U.S. would deploy all that power in war. Nor could they accept that fighting spirit could not compensate for material shortages. In retrospect, Japan's awakening came too late. They had misjudged their opponent from the beginning, believing America was a weak, soft, and indecisive society incapable of sustaining war. They underestimated national unity, vast industrial capacity, and American resolve. From Pearl Harbor to the final battles, warnings had appeared but were ignored. Data existed but was dismissed. The result was millions dead, an empire destroyed, and a painful lesson about the connection between industrial capacity and war outcomes. This belated awakening, beyond military defeat, left a lasting strategic lesson for Japan in the post-war era. Rebuilding from the ashes, Japan realized that true power does not come from weapons or war, but from industry, organization, education, and international cooperation. By the 1980s, Japan had become the world's second-largest economy, demonstrating that the harsh lessons of war had been transformed into a framework for building a peaceful and prosperous nation.